in the context of yoga practice, and in fact, in the context of everyday life, we normally feel a very tight connection between the body and the mind. And so, as an example of this, just how our posture and how the way we hold our body affects the way we feel is kind of obvious, perhaps too obvious to even make a point about. So if I stand like this, or I stand like this, maybe it's a subtle difference, but the feeling is quite different. And I think everyone that would just try that out would feel that difference. And indeed, this constitutes a big part of what this book is about, which we call just explorations. And these are all sorts of experiments that one does in order to see how the mind might affect the body and how the body might affect the mind. So in a very practical way and in the context of yoga exercises. And this is basically what we call the Psychophysical Lab. But so why is this a problem? Well, because if you're trained as a philosopher, or if you know a little bit about how the mind affects the body and how the body affects the mind, you actually come across a wall. And that wall is what we call the mind-body problem. So what is this wall I have in mind? We usually think about the mind, the mental, as something which is subjective, as something that only I can feel and sense, while we think about the body as something that is in the public realm and that everyone can observe, and also that science can observe. But if we go deeper into what is the body and what is the mind, and we take some of the common notions about this, we see that these two things don't have much in common. And this is the way the problem is articulated, the way we inherited the problem as articulated by Descartes, so that the body is seen as something that observed, can be investigated, can be measured through scientific tools. But whatever it is that happens inside us, as it were, in our psyche, is something that cannot. You have to ask the person how they feel and what is it they feel and so on, that it's something that cannot be observed. And so, furthermore, according to Descartes, the body is something that is extended in space, and the mind is something that is not in space at all. And so the question of how they affect one another becomes really enigmatic. So for me, as I'm practicing yoga, this question is kind of in the background. I mean, how could we make sense of this if this is the case? And indeed, it's considered as a problem that some argue is insoluble, some argue is the hardest problem there's been in philosophy, and so on and so forth. The other point I'd like to make is that it's not just a problem for philosophers. In fact, I think it's a problem that infects all of us, because it's a problem that is institutionalized in many ways and throughout history, so that if you look at the medical institutions, we see that, very broadly speaking, we have medical institution that takes care of the body, and then we have a different kind of medicine or medical institution that's supposed to take care of the psyche. The issue comes up both as institutional and also as practical, because we often have an issue that requires us to decide, say, if you can't sleep at night, what sort of treatment do you need? Is that a physical issue? I mean, something wrong with your body, or is something wrong with your mind? You sort of have to answer this question to yourself, depending on who you're going to consult. You know, we have science that takes care of our body, and another kind of science that takes care of the soul, but there is no science, or there is no treatment for the human being, for the person. All right, the approach we take in the book is that in the part that I've written, that is the third chapter, it's basically an attempt to answer the question, how this problem come about? How is it that we've become entangled in this state of affairs that I've just described? I actually came to the conclusion that you cannot answer this question without going rather deeply into the history of, I would say, Western philosophy and culture, and sort of trying to trace the different steps or the different main views that created that situation. And so in the book I go back to Plato and Aristotle, and here already in ancient Greek you find the main two articulations or how the psyche and the soma are related to one another. And in Plato we find the dualistic approach where the psyche is not only separable but in fact separated from the body upon death, and also where the psyche is treated as that part of the human being that has the capacity to control the body. And so for Plato, it's really the soul, the psyche, that is the dominant aspect of human being and therefore is identified with the self. Now, in Aristotle, we find an entirely different approach. And that approach, in fact, is so different from what we're used to today that it's even different for us to comprehend. But basically, I would state the Aristotelian position as follows. So for Aristotle, the psyche is not a thing. It's not an entity. It's basically just a feature of what he says of living things. So it's a way to classify all living things as having certain capacities. So all living things have the capacity for self-motion or for self-nutrition. And so in that regard, plants and animals also have a psyche because they have these capacities. Now, animals also have sensitive capacities, and so they have sensitive souls. And then human beings have the capacity to language and for thought, and so they're regarded as speaking animals or rational animals. But the main point is that the mind is not regarded as something that is first separable from the body or something that is even an entity. We have an animal, human being, that consists of necessarily of body and soul. And these two aspects are constitutive of what an animal or any living thing is. Descartes, much later, who was strongly anti-Aristotelian, we actually have entirely different agenda, an entirely different conception that has become very dominant. And according to Descartes, what we have is basically the body and the mind are seen as precisely separate entities. And so the distinction between them, as Descartes says, is real. What this means is that they are considered as two different substances, as two different entities that are characterized in so different ways such that the relation between them become a problem. Descartes kind of solves this problem by saying that there is a connection in the pineal gland in the brain, and somehow there is an interaction. But from day one, this solution has seemed very, very unsatisfactory and was actually never really accepted. The Cartesian view or outlook is one that still dominates the current situation, so that science can investigate the body, but we have no comparable science to investigate the mind. And so this gave rise to psychology and the mind-body problem that we experience today. And let me just end by saying that in the book, we're taking very seriously the idea of exploring the Aristotelian conception as a human being, as a psychophysical unity with a variety of capacities. So the second chapter is really dedicated to investigating particular capacities in particular contexts, that is, through particular yoga exercises and how they might extend beyond the practice. Thank you.
Thank you.